again to Minor Slug and everyone for contributing to that. It's great. And I'm really excited to welcome Danny Nemu. I will stick to what I have decided is the aesthetic of Teddy Bear Talks and not really explain anything and allow him to explain as he likes. And yeah, please welcome Danny. This is going to be great. Revelations, etc.
Thank you very much. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. So, my name's Danny Nemu, and I'm here to talk about the apocalypse in art and science. But what has the apocalypse got to do with art and science, I hear you ask? Thinking of things like this, images of death and destruction and the end of the world. That's not the apocalypse we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the word as it comes from the Greek, and it comes from, I'm going to do my best here, apo and kalypto, which is un and cover, or away and cover. It means to remove a veil, and that's the word that we have in English, revelation. Re is away and velum is a veil. So other cognates there are unveiling, disclosure and discovery. And the secondary, the meaning that we associate with it, which is the doom and destruction, comes from a very specific vision that a very specific man had and wrote into a book which became the last book of the Bible, which is called Apocalypse. And the first word of the book is Apocalypse. So, this is St. Paul's Apocalypse on the road to Damascus, and you can see something that was hidden, this angel in this case, being revealed. And when you see the word apocalypse in the Bible, this is what you see. For example, when ye come together, every one of you hath a psalm, hath a doctrine, hath a tongue, hath a revelation, hath an interpretation. So a revelation is something we can bring to a party, and maybe someone else will have an interpretation for it. It's not the end of the world. Now, in case you thought we would let the angels take all the glory in this story, I want to introduce El Diavolo, and here he is in Giuseppe Tartini's dream, playing the fiddle to him. And this is the song he played. I'm going to play it to Tartini, and then Tartini wrote it down when he woke up. And it's called Trillo del Diavolo. And it goes like this. So there he is. This is a form of revelation, seeing something in a dream which you then bring back into the world afterwards. Nietzsche spoke about revelation in these terms. He said, revelation in the sense that something becomes suddenly visible and audible with indescribable certainty and accuracy. Everything seems to present itself as the readiest, the correctest and the simplest means of expression. And then he talks a little bit more about what it's like. Everything happens quite involuntarily, as if in a tempestuous outburst of freedom, of absoluteness, of power and divinity. Ecstasy, a flood of tears, fine thrills and quiverings to the very toes. One is the mere incarnation, mouthpiece or medium of an almighty power. I have never had any choice in the matter. And this is Nietzsche, and I was chatting to someone about him a little bit earlier today, and he really changed very much the way we think about power and pity in the world, Nietzsche. The final artist we're going to talk about is Mozart. He had a bit of a better time of it. Nietzsche, interestingly, he wrote the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in 10 days when he had a fit of tuberculosis. He was a very sickly man all his life, and in his worst ever winter he wrote this book. Mozart wrote, when he was alone and of good cheer, say, travelling in a carriage, or walking after a good meal, or during the night when I cannot sleep. Whence and how they come, I know not, nor can I force them. He's talking about his musical pieces. Nor do I hear in my imagination the parts successively, but all at once, in a pleasing, lively dream. What he's talking about here is a hypnagogic trance, which is a state in between being asleep and being awake. And this is a state where we get a lot of both artists and scientists having their revelations. The committing to paper is done quickly enough because it's all finished, is what he said. So what has this got to do with science, I hear you ask? Science is about the careful measurement of things. It's about bubbling test tubes and Richard Dawkins presenting his ideas on things, and journals and peer review and rigorous academic thought. is it not? Well, that is certainly part of science, and this here is the structural theory. Sorry, it's the structure of the 30S ribosome subunits. Fantastic, but where did the actual structural theory itself come from? It came from Kekule when he was. One fine summer evening, as I was returning by the last omnibus, I fell into a reverie, and lo, the atoms were gambolling before my eyes. Two smaller atoms united to form a pair. Two larger ones formed a chain, dragging the smaller ones after them. The cry of the conductor Clapham Road awakened me from my dreaming. So he went home and then he sketched the structural theory down, and this has become the basis of how we think about organic chemistry, how we think about chemicals, how they fit together. The numbers didn't work for benzene. There was far too much carbon and not enough hydrogen, and he couldn't work out until one day I was sitting writing at my textbook, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I turned my chair towards the fire and dozed. Again, atoms were gambolling before my eyes, but look, what was that? One of the snakes had seized hold of its own tail, and the form whirled mockingly. This was the form of the benzene ring. In fact, what he saw there was the Ouroboros, which is interesting in itself because the Ouroboros is the form of the Midgard serpent. The Midgard serpent is a snake which goes around the world in Norse mythology, and at the Norse apocalypse, or the Norse Ragnarok, it's the Midgard serpent which destroys the world. So he saw this image and he understood that to be the benzene ring, and that's why we know what the shape of the benzene ring is. All from a dream. So we're not talking about careful measurement, we're talking about something else in science, and that is the eureka moment. This is Archimedes, who had his eureka moment and ran through the streets of Greece naked, apparently. Eureka means I found it, which implies that it was hidden and then it's being found. So we're talking about a discovery, and discovery is of course a discover, things waiting in the shadows for their covers to be dissed. And we're back with our old friend, apocalypse. But that was a long time ago, so let's talk about a slightly more recent apocalypse. Melvin Calvin, who won a Nobel Prize for chemistry for the Calvin cycle, and he discovered that whilst he was in a car park waiting for his wife. Suddenly, in a matter of seconds, the cyclic character of the path of carbon became apparent to me. And he's talking about a really complicated cycle, which is the basis of photosynthesis. And he wasn't thinking about that at the time, but that's what came to him in this flash. Nikola Tesla. He was walking along in Budapest, in Central Park in Budapest, reciting poetry with a friend, and he was struck by a vision, frozen to the spot by a vision of the AC motor, which appeared to him with all the clarity of metal. And this is the AC motor which powers our national grids at the moment. It's used in many things. We can't really imagine the world without it, and in fact without any of Nikola Tesla's other patents. Now, he never made a calculation, and he never made a blueprint, he never made diagrams. What he did was he would lie down on the couch at night, sometimes during the day. I saw new scenes, at first blurred and indistinct. They would flit away when I tried to concentrate my attention on them. They gained strength and distinctness, and finally assumed the concreteness of real things. I needed no models, drawing, or experiments. And this man took about 700 patents. You can see some of them here. The AC motor, the Tesla coil, which is the basis of radio, television, robotics, the and logic gate, cosmic waves, which he discovered, and standing waves. It's very difficult to imagine the world without this man's apocalypses. And we're talking, and this is another guy who had a flash of inspiration, and it came from some source invisible and undefinable. When he was a young man, when he was a teenager, he was visited by God and given the mission to represent thought as processes, mathematical processes. This is what he says anyway. And he came up with Boolean algebra. Boolean algebra is the basis of a computer processor. Whenever you run a Google search, that's Boolean algebra that you're using. It came to him in a sudden flash. And this is Ramanujan, who was an Indian mathematician. He was extremely poor. He didn't even have enough money for paper most of the time, so he wrote his proofs without writing the workings out. And after he died at the age of 33. And after he died, mathematicians set to try and work out what he was doing, and opened up entire new fields of maths. His mathematics are used in string theory at the moment. Yes.
I was going to say, is that the guy who solved Fermat's last theorem?
I don't know.
Okay.
Is the answer to that?
The A squared, B squared, C squared thing.
I still don't know.
Okay. Is Paul still? Okay. Sorry, carry on.
I don't know, but I don't know anything about maths, but his mathematics came to him from his family goddess, which appeared to him in dreams. And he said this beautiful quote, "An equation for me has no meaning unless it represents a thought of God." And this is one of the things that his goddess gave to him in his hypnagogic trance in the morning. So, we've talked about flashes of inspiration, Tesla's vision in the car park, or the Calvin cycle, which came... Sorry, it was Calvin's vision in the car park, Tesla's vision in Budapest. We've talked about Boole contemplating mysticism. There's another time when we get our revelations, which is in dreaming. We've talked about the Indian mathematician, we've talked about the devil playing this beautiful music to Tartini, and Lowy, who's an interesting character. He won his Nobel Prize for physiology, and he had a chat to his friend one day about chemical transmission, where he thought that nerves transmitted their information through chemical transmission, but he couldn't think of a way to test this, and he forgot about it. And this is what he wrote 17 years later. "It occurred to me at 6 o'clock in the morning that during the night I had written down something important, but I was unable to decipher the scrawl. The next night, at 3 o'clock, the idea returned. If I had carefully considered it in the daytime, I would have undoubtedly rejected the kind of experiment I performed." So we're talking about a very different part of the mind which is working here. It's not the logical part, and in fact the logical part wouldn't have been very interested in that. So these are our hypnagogic trance. Can you hear the devil playing his violin? Getting going. And waking out of dreaming is another time when very important insights have come to people, including Einstein. Now Einstein spent weeks in states of nervous confusion, and he was really upset about the fact that he couldn't get to the bottom of these physical problems, or problems in physics rather. And one morning he woke as if a storm broke loose in my mind. He started scribbling, he got his theory down, he sent it off. It took him a couple of weeks, and then he went back to bed ill of all the strain, and that was the theory of special relativity. So, genius. Einstein's a genius, isn't he? What does genius mean? Genius, according to the Romans, was a spirit, and there he is, that's a genius. He's got a tray on his hand because he was the spirit who would give us things from hidden dimensions. And what he would give us was inspiration. Inspiration, of course, comes from Latin as well, and it means to breathe into, in inspirare. It's the spirit who breathes information into you. Isn't that strange? Alfred Wallace. What can you tell me about Alfred Wallace?
He actually made the discoveries before Darwin, but Darwin got the credit for it.
Marvellous, okay. So Alfred Wallace, he was an explorer and a collector of specimens, and he was in the Malay Peninsula. There he is with his specimens, and a mosquito bit him, gave him malaria, and he spent 3 days with a malarial fever, and he was too ill to write, but when he came out of his fever, he wrote down what he had discovered and put it in a packet and sent it to his friend Darwin. Darwin was used to receiving specimens from his travels, and he was horrified to open it up and to find a theory exactly the same as his own, which he'd spent decades working on, comparing specimens and doing all kinds of very deep work, and didn't want to publish because he was worried about it being a very shocking theory. And it's not entirely certain that he would have even published without this impetus from Alfred Wallace. He published the following year. So it looks like the genius sometimes is pushing. He's got an urgent agenda. This is another chap, Isaac Newton, who discovered calculus and kept it to himself for 10 years. And he used to perform his, when he published, he would replace all the calculus with regular maths, so no one would find out about it. But Leibniz discovered it on his own 10 years later, and Newton fell into a terrible paranoia about how this happened. Now, Newton discovered two things in the same year. It was the year 1066, and he'd fled London because, like all astronomers, he knew that comets were a symbol of God's wrath. And a comet passed over London in 1664, followed immediately followed very soon after by the plague. And another one passed over in 1665. He'd seen enough, and he left before the Great Fire of London. So there he was away, and this was the time of his life where he devoted most of his time to alchemical experiments. A tenth of his library was devoted to alchemical experiments, and gravity comes straight from the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, as above, so below. And gravity was the first theory, a universal theory, so it worked on the movements of planets and the movements at our level, apples falling and things like that. Before that, physics was a set of theories governing different areas. So he really brought the whole world together. So, apocalypse is something which happens to an individual, like this. But in fact, what happens is that apocalypse actually, that insight which a person sees changes our world and opens up new realms which were hidden. For example, Tesla's AC motor has totally changed the way we interact with the world. Einstein's ideas have changed the way we think about physics and changed the possibilities. I mean, Boolean algebra is another example. I mean, you couldn't do a Google search without it. He's revealing revealing a world which is hidden. Illness is another area where we talked about the flash of insight. We talked about dozing scientists. We talked about illness, Nietzsche and Wallace, the malarial evolutional chap, and let's talk about drugs. Mark Pesky, who came up with virtual reality, which is about as much another world as you can imagine. He came up with that. No, let's talk about Carrie Mullis first. I took plenty of LSD and I found it to be a mind-opening experience. It was certainly much more important than any courses I ever took. He took a Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1993 for the RNA polymerase reaction, which is what we use when we do DNA testing. And he visualized the molecular concepts when he was on acid. And actually was quite a lot of the work after that, the working out the fine detail, was done by other people. So again, you're talking about two different parts of the mind, the analytical mind and the creative mind. And that's the RNA polymerase reaction. Mark Pesky, he says something beautiful about virtual reality. He's talking about his experience with psychedelics, and he says, psychedelics have certainly been facilitators or catalysts for that. The most striking example is all the cyberspace protocols. I mean, wham, it came to me just like that, and I just saw them. I got the big picture, but the big picture said, okay, well, you know roughly how to make it work. Now you have to go in and do the detail, right? And this is, so this was the basis of virtual reality. And also he said something fantastic about bliss. He said, my bliss was revealed through the psychedelic experience. Now I won't make any attributions to what the divine is, but if psychedelics reveal the divine or allow you to eminentize it, to see it physically, or this sort of thing, wouldn't it make sense for that moment to be synonymous with the moment of revealing what your bliss is? Sue Blackmore, she's fond of cannabis and said, I can honestly say that without cannabis, most of my scientific research had never been done, and most of my books on psychology would never have been written. She wrote The Meme Machine, which is again describing a whole different layer of our world which we can't normally see. And Sam Patterson, who was named 1996 Inventor of the Year. He makes all kinds of bicycle cogs, and the way he does it is by going down to the beach, smoking his pipe, and doodling cogs until, in a brief flash, a complete solution goes off. That's when I start sketching like mad. If I'm lucky, I can draw it all out in the sketch. I don't fully comprehend it until it's finished. What are we talking about here? The unconscious, whatever that might be. Milton Erickson talked about it in terms of the creative and healing part of the brain. His own insights, which became the basis of NLP, came to him in blinding flashes of light.
So what's NLP?
Neuro-linguistic programming. It's a way of reprogramming the mind, if you like. So Freud is the man who invented the unconscious, or discovered the unconscious, although he called it the subconscious. And he was talking about, he called it the subconscious because he thought that it needed to be subservient, submissive to the conscious. and he thought about it as a very unruly place, the seat of neurosis, which didn't respect chronology or morals or anything like that. Now, what we have to remember about Freud and about drug-fueled revelation generally is that you need to be quite careful with what drugs you're using, because the specific nature of the drug influences the revelation. And he was a coke fiend. He spent 10 years of lively coke use, and the nature of his revolution was A, he invented the ego, B, he reduced everything that crossed the mind to sex, and C, he wanted the unconscious to be subservient to the subconscious, to the conscious. I apologise. Finally, meditation. Swedenborg was a polyglot and the foremost mineralogist in Europe when he was alive in the 1700s. And when he was a child, whenever he concentrated, he used to meditate on his breath. And angels would visit him and teach him further breath techniques. And he had imaginary friends. His imaginary friends lasted with him into adulthood. And his parents were so impressed with his imaginary friends, that with the wisdom of them, that they believed in them as well. He was also visited by God, who followed him home in London, apparently, on occasion. This is what he said about what we would call the subatomic world. This universal, including its smallest particles, is a work coherent as a unit, to the extent that no one part can be touched and affected without some sense of it overflowing to all the rest. What he's talking about here is Bell's interconnectiveness, which kind of physics caught up with about 250 years later, after we had lots of new experiments. He also said, the smaller and closer the parts are to the simple substratum, the smaller they are in mass, their dissimilarities soften, their imperfections decrease, and their forms become more perfect. They are also lighter and quicker in their motion. He's talking about atoms, or even the subatomic world here, back in the 1700s. And if we're going to talk about meditation, we should probably talk about Buddha. And he said this. He talked about innumerable millions of kalapas in perpetual motion and flux, constantly forming and dissolving, each one 467,656, the size of a particle of dust raised by a chariot's wheel in summer. So the world he's describing there is astonishing, astonishingly close to how we think of the world now, even with the idea of trying to get across the size of it. So if you don't, there are other rituals you can engage in. If it's not science, you can go to the Spiritist church, which is always very interesting. I don't suggest you go there to believe in it, but it can be very interesting when you go. These are all Spiritist scientists. Alfred Wallace, for example. Thank you very much for your talk.
Sorry.
Bye-bye.
Just as you're talking about Wallace again.
Yeah. So Alfred Wallace, he was a Spiritist. As was Marie Curie, who is about one of the very few people ever to get 2 Nobel Prizes, the first woman who won a Nobel Prize. She used to use the seance, used to treat the seance as an experiment. She took detailed notes, she had controls. Sir William Crookes also treated the seance as an experiment, and he nearly got kicked out of the Royal Society for reporting what he'd seen, including levitation, spontaneous appearance of writing, and he did some of the first work in plasma chemistry and nuclear chemistry. So in Spiritism, there's the idea that spirits give information from the other side, and these are scientists who've picked up information from some very interesting places. Alchemy. As we said, Newton was an alchemist, as was Paracelsus, and when he used to write, he would write until, with boots and spurs and fully dressed, he throws himself into bed and rests merely for 3 hours or so, then writes on again. So we're talking about a very speedy transmission, a very urgent transmission. So, let's talk about apocalyptic scientists. Paracelsus was the man who united medicine, alchemy and natural philosophy. He was the first person to see that those 3 fields are part of the same thing. So this is, in a sense, an unveiling, a lifting of a veil between different fields. Newton did the same thing with mechanics, maths and astronomy, and Swedenborg did the same thing with his hierarchy of forms. It's one of the things that apocalyptic scientists have in common. They also often think they're chosen by God. Paracelsus felt he was chosen by God to blot out all the fantasies of elaborate and false works. This was the man who attacked classical medicine, which was the idea that a disease was an imbalance. He said, no, it's not. A disease is a thing, and he would tune into the nature of the disease and then tune into a metal or to a plant which had that same signature and use the plant to treat the disease. And this is the basis of modern pharmacology, the idea that you can use a certain agent to treat a specific disease. Newton saw his mission in the anagram of his name, Jehovah Sanctus Unus. He believed he was chosen by God to interpret the book of Daniel. His interest in planetary motion, his interest in chronology and all that was secondary to his interest in scripture. He was trying to date the final, he was trying to date the end of time, really. And Swedenborg thought he was chosen to announce the coming of the new church following the Last Judgment. And Boole also thought he'd been given a mission. There's another interesting thing about apocalyptic scientists. A lot of them do obsess about the end of the world. Paracelsus, his last book was called Prophecy for the Next 24 Years. It talked about floods and the coming of the Antichrist and all those kind of things. Newton wrote 4,500 pages on an apocalyptic investigation. It took 50 years of his life. He never came up with a final date. And Swedenborg, as we said, thought the Last Judgment would come in 1757. This hasn't finished. Real top scientists are still worrying about the end of the world. Einstein made these 3 quotes. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Yeah. Problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them, and a new type of thinking is essential if mankind is to survive and move towards higher levels. So this first one here is talking about the vulgar idea of the apocalypse that we often have about the end of the world. This second one, he's talking about scientific progress, the solutions to problems being from outside of the world you know. And the third one, a new type of thinking is essential if mankind is to survive and move towards higher areas. He's making the same point, but about geopolitics. He was really worried about what would happen. There's actually another way in which Einstein was very apocalyptic, in that he came up with E equals mc squared, and without that we wouldn't have any nuclear weapons. So in a sense he actually brought us closer to our possible destruction. These two scientists, Feynman and Oppenheimer, worked on the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer died of a nervous wreck, totally worried about the fact that he brought a nuke into the world that he thought was going to be the end for all of us. Feynman too. And Stephen Hawking, finally, wrote this on Yahoo Answers quite recently. In a world that is in chaos politically, socially, environmentally, how can the human race sustain another 100 years? His answer, about a month later, was, I don't know. So, as we come to the end of my talk, how do we do this? How do we bring the apocalypse into our lives? Well, firstly, we can learn to meditate, which is always very good. Or we can visit the seance. Or automatic writing. Automatic writing is where you take some paper and you just let your hand go, either writing or drawing. This is actually quite dangerous unless you dress up like a Japanese schoolgirl. Drugs. That is how you make a joint. Taking drugs is a very good way to open new insights. However, we need to be careful with our doses. And making a nice joint with tobacco, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you really want to get some insights, make a big joint. If it's mushrooms, what was the full McKenna?
5
grams of mushrooms, please.
Fresh or dried?
Dried. And most importantly, one of the things that is important, most importantly here is silence. The parts of your brain which work with language are not the parts of your brain which receive insights. If we had some more time, we could talk about neurobiology. But when you take drugs or when you meditate, of course, you're silent. But when you take drugs, it's very good to sit in complete silence with your friends and to see what comes up. And there's another sense in which silence is very important. my website discusses apocalyptic topics, and as you can imagine, I get all kinds of emails from people who think they are the Messiah. And if your insight is that you are the Messiah, I suggest very strongly that you keep that to yourself. So finally, what remains for me to do is plug my book. That's my website. You can see the stickers all around there. My book is in the process of editing because my own apocalypse, my own series of apocalypses, which led to the book, was, well, I'll tell you about it actually. I was an insomniac for most of my life, and one day I smoked a big bong actually, and I had some very interesting experiences in somatic experiences. And after that, I found that my insomnia took on it changed a little bit, and I would get a very urgent desire to write something, and I would pick up a pen and I'd write, and I collected about 90 of these just scraps of paper, and a friend of mine saw some writing I'd done on the internet. She said, "Have you got any more?" And I said, "I've just got these horrible scraps of paper." And she said, can I read one?" And I read one to her because they were scrawls, and she helped me categorise them and put them into a book, which I've written, but to be honest, it needs a good editor, and I'm in the process of re-editing it. So there it is. If you'd like to look at it, it's on my website. Thank you very much.
It's a damn good book, by the way.
Thank you. And the third edition is going to be even better. So that's the end of my talk. If anyone would like to ask some questions, and ask questions of each other and not just of me. Yes?
I had a really boring question to ask.
Well done, Kev.
Yeah, that's kind of how.
Let's have it.
Do you know Thomas Kuhn? So Thomas Kuhn is a philosopher of science who talks about the idea that there are moments within science where there's a sudden explosion. So something like the special theory of relativity invoke an explosion within that field of physics, which means that people kind of go, "Oh, someone's discovered something. Let's do a shitload of work." I'm kind of interested in whether or not does the interest in the apocalypse precipitate or come after? Does that make sense? Or is that
Yeah, it wasn't a boring question. It's a really good question. The reason I got interested in this whole field was because I did a dissertation on. I was comparing 17th century apocalyptic movements and current apocalyptic movements, particularly Jehovah's Witnesses, and I looked at a whole bunch of scientists, Paracelsus and a bunch more, and loads of them were really thinking about the apocalypse or eschatology. Like, for example, the Puritans in 1605, they set sail to the New World. So that was very much a hidden was revealed, something that was unknown became known to them. But 1605, a Puritan called Francis Bacon developed the scientific method. All happened in very much the same period. And the move to America that the Puritans made was very much vocalized in terms of, we're going to go and found New Jerusalem in the new era. You find that the event seems to coincide. When you get like an upsurge of apocalyptic art, for example, you get like a whole load of apocalypses in the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. You get this period of all these kind of apocalyptic. When I'm talking about like the apocalypse of John, for example, but there's loads of them. There's apocalypse of Adam, and there's hundreds of these texts, and they all kind of flourished in this era. And then that very local community got destroyed by the Romans, and not only that, but the story which the people of Judea had been following got spread out to the entire world. So it did make a massive change in the world. And what you're talking about there with Kuhn's scientific revolutions, think about what happened after Newton. He brought, in the space of 1 year, into this world calculus, which is the mathematics of moving bodies. Before that, you couldn't really work out how something behaved. You couldn't predict something moving, right? And he brought the theory of gravity into the world. So that opened up massive new areas of study, and that's what the apocalypse is. It's the lifting of a veil, something that's hidden, something that we really can't make sense of, becomes subject to rational thought through the new things that have been discovered, through these new formulas that can be applied. Do you see what I'm saying? Why the individual becomes collective, and why it's not just important for that one particular person who's respected in his field, because it changes the entire world.
Yeah, global ramifications of that.
And what you have in Europe is you have this kind of apocalyptic wave which starts in the 14th century. In Italy, you have these new arts, you have these new ideas. For example, you have objectivity in art. You have the idea of the canvas being a window onto another world and the artist stepping out of it. And you get this idea of perspective, for example, applying mathematics to the picture. And that's a very similar idea to doing an experiment on a thing, putting a frame around it, stepping outside of it, and applying mathematics to the world. So you get the same idea of objectivity and mathematics popping up first in art. You get it in music, you get it in magic as well, with the idea of a circle and certain names which are worked out with magical mathematical squares. You get it all over, and you get this wave that kicks off there in the Renaissance, and then it goes north into Germany, and you get the Reformation. You get like the 1526, I think it was, Luther knocks his thing onto the wall. So you get a whole religious revolution happening in Germany, and it went west into Spain, and you get the voyages of discovery. So you get the New World discovered, then you get the French Sun Kings, then you get the English Renaissance, which is the scientific Renaissance. So as this kind of wave spread across Europe, and it spread actually as far as the shores of the New World, where it decimated the populations there. So there was this wave which transformed everywhere it went, but it took quite a long time. So an apocalypse is something which happens firstly to an individual and then to a community. But also that community, it can kind of form a wave, and now we've got a very interesting situation where we have a world which waves move very much faster in this world. And there's a whole lot of apocalyptic art coming out at the moment, a ridiculous number of apocalyptic films. The film Apocalypto, or Independence Day, or these films which show destruction of worlds. That's what I mean in this sense. You get it also in the 16th century, poems on these themes. You get
Paradise Lost or something like that.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. It pops up in various formats. But I guess I was being unclear, because there's this other idea of apocalypse being a new realm. You get it in music. You get polytonal music, for example, happening in the Renaissance. Before that, you didn't have it. So you didn't have this idea of stuff going on at the same place. And then you get a whole new bunch of music in the end of the 19th century, where the melody kind of gets lost in the harmonies, and that's a new idea. So it opens up new areas for the mind to explore.
But it's like keen, it's the paradigm shift. As soon as the revelation or the apocalyptic moment or whatever, then you accept it, and then it doesn't become apocalyptic anymore.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, and you look at what happened in the 17th century, you had the 80 Years' War, you had the 30 Years' War, you had areas of Germany where 2/3 of the male population wiped out, you had hundreds and hundreds of villages burned, you had the whole of Europe went bankrupt. But the introduction of, for example, firearms into Europe, it was a big thing. The introduction of the printing press made revolutionary ideas spread more easily, and they spread particularly amongst reformists and Protestants. Right? So these things all play off each other. It's not just a revolution in science. It's a revolution in art. It's a revolution in social relations. It's a revolution in
quite close to the idea of zeitgeist.
Yeah.
So the spirit of the time. Is this a Christian sentiment you're expressing?
I don't know.
I think the more contemporary equivalent, I think, would be the end of the Mayan long count, which some people saw was the end of the world, whereas the Mayans always conceived it as the start of a new age. But it's also equivalent to the card 13 in the tarot deck, which is death or it's change. And I think this dichotomy between apocalypse and revelation has always existed. And the end is not necessarily the end, it's the beginning.
Dinosaurs they got a fair share of the standard model of apocalypse, and without that, there would be none of this at all. Like mammals with fingers that could manipulate stuff and create fucking MacBooks and marble tables and little cubby holes underground where we can.
But we really
about
misunderstand dinosaurs.
Let's take the dinosaurs upstairs, and I'd just like to say thank you very much to Dolly for organising this.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much to Danny. That was a fantastic talk, and to everyone who contributed. Yeah!